So David Fincher has been in talks to direct a Spider-Man film, an adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 2 Star Wars films, and so many others that didn't make it to screen. So I'm going to go through a whole bunch of his unmade films, and I'm going to rank the ones that I'm most interested in seeing. All the way back in 1999, David Fincher went in to pitch on a Spider-Man movie. There's very little information about it, but apparently he wanted to skip the entire origin story and do that in a music video-like montage so that he could skip to the grown-up Peter Parker. Fincher had no interest in doing a fun, light-hearted Spider-Man and apparently wanted to focus on a guy who's settled into being a freak. And when you look at the rest of David Fincher's filmography and the dark, eccentric characters that he usually focuses on, that makes a lot of sense. The villain would have been the Green Goblin, and of course David Fincher would have wanted to adapt the darkest Spider-Man story, the death of Gwen Stacy. But Sony did not like his pitch at all, so he did not get the job. It's really fascinating to think about what would have happened if he had directed this film. If it had been super successful, would it have changed the approach of superhero films over the next coming years? Or if it had flopped, would that have stopped other superhero films from being made? Ultimately, I'm really glad it was Sam Raimi who was chosen to do those movies. I think it all ultimately worked out for the best, but it really is a fascinating what if. David Fincher's Spider-Man, I'd give a C. So The Goon is this comic book series set in this supernatural world filled with zombies and vampires, and it's about this big muscly enforcer called the Goon and his sidekick Frankie. They both claim to work for the gangster Labrazio, but they'd secretly both murdered him years earlier and keep the rumor up that he's still alive. David Fincher was set to helm an animated adaptation of this, and it actually got pretty far in development. Clancy Brown and Paul Giamatti were set to star, and there was already a trailer mocked up for it.
Eyeball this thing for me a second, will you, Frankie? Found him behind the bar, eating alley cats.
But even with an A-list director and even with stars like this, it never actually went into official production. So they actually set up a Kickstarter campaign to try and fund a story reel. It would essentially be an animatic they could show to investors to try and get the film funded. And they even reached their Kickstarter goal of $400,000 to get the story reel made, but when they took it round to investors, no one was actually interested in making the full movie. And if you can't raise the money to get the film made, then there's not going to be a movie. So the project lay dormant for years and David Fincher moved on to other things. But in 2022, Netflix announced that they were going to be doing an adaptation of The Goon with Patrick Osborne directing. Now who knows how this will all change since it was first developed in 2008, but I'm glad that this one is actually hopefully getting off the ground and we'll get to see some version of this on screen because the test footage that they made for it looked fantastic. But I think the David Fincher version, if I were to rank it, I give this an A. Okay, so this one really surprised me, but David Fincher was approached to direct Star Wars Episode 7 and then again to direct Star Wars Episode 9. And look, we don't know what happened in those meetings. Just because a studio meets with a director, that doesn't mean they're going to be offered the job, or even that the director wants the job. But the fact that Disney asked him for Episode 7 and then asked him again for Episode 9 is kind of crazy. Like, this is purely speculation on my part, but they wouldn't ask him again if the first meeting had gone completely terribly, or they thought there was no chance of getting him. So just the fact that David Fincher would even be vaguely interested in directing a Star Wars movie is kind of crazy to me. The only thing Fincher has publicly said about it is that the pressure to make a Star Wars film would be immense, and the pressure for the film to be financially successful as well. And so you can understand why he wouldn't want any of the baggage of directing a Star Wars movie. But it's a fascinating what if, because the challenges of opening a trilogy and closing a trilogy are very different. Obviously with a first movie, with an Episode 7, he would have a little bit more control to define the direction of the rest of the franchise. And on the flip side, if he were to do Episode 9, he would have had to conform to what happened with The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. And in both scenarios, I really wonder how he would have changed his style to meet the demands of both movies. But yeah, it's kind of crazy that this was ever a possibility. I think I'd give this a B. So there's a lot of odd projects on this, but World War Z 2 is one of the weirdest to me. So after the moderate success of the first World War Z film, there was interest in doing a sequel. And there was a couple of different directors attached at different points, but nothing ever really came to fruition. But then the studio approached David Fincher. Now he obviously has a history with Brad Pitt. He'd worked with him on Fight Club, on Seven, on The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And the new head of Paramount Pictures had previously worked with Fincher on Fight Club and Gone Girl. So there were strong relationships there behind the scenes, and they managed to convince Fincher to sign on to this. And this is one that very nearly actually happened. It was scheduled to shoot in 2018, but then it kept getting pushed back and pushed back. Eventually, in a strange twist, the Chinese government banned movies containing ghosts or zombies. And that was a big problem for World War Z too, because the Chinese market had become a big revenue source for blockbuster movies. And when that initial film had made $500 million, and the second one was going to carry a budget of $200 million, trying to do that without the Chinese market made it a much more risky bet. So Paramount pulled the plug on it and the project was dead. But I was just shocked that Fincher would take this kind of job in the first place. He hasn't really touched big studio tentpole films since Alien 3, and he'd just come off the back of The Social Network and Gone Girl, which were both critical and commercial successes. So it's not like he needed to take a studio job, and almost everything he's done in live action has always been very grounded, so just the idea of him doing a zombie film seems a little bit outside of that. And I remember when the news of this came out, when it was announced that he'd be doing this project, I was kind of excited about it because it just seemed like such a weird choice for him to make. That said, I'm kind of glad this didn't happen. I just don't love the first movie enough to get excited about a sequel, even with David Fincher doing it. It seems even Fincher himself is glad that it didn't happen, because he said that The Last of Us was able to cover a lot of the stuff he wanted to in the sequel, and on television they were able to do that with a lot more real estate. So yeah, I think the fact that this movie almost happened is more interesting to me than the reality of what it may have been. I think I'd give this a D. So in 2009, David Fincher had directed The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo based on the book of this same name. But that book is part of a trilogy, and so they had planned to adapt the next two books as well. That would be The Girl Who Played with Fire and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. But the rest of the trilogy was put into question after the first film slightly underperformed at the box office. And it was put under more strain when Fincher actually wanted to increase the budget for the sequels. But even with that, Sony was going to go ahead with it, and a 2013 release date for the next film was set. Unfortunately, that was not a deadline they were able to meet. There was a lot of delays with getting the script together, and so with Sony waiting around for it for so long, and with there being already a lot of concerns about making it in the first place, the plug was pulled. Of all the unmade films on this list, The Girl Who Played with Fire and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest are the only sequels, so they're the easiest ones to imagine. And that has the kind of ironic effect of making them both more interesting to think about and less interesting. More interesting because the series is unfinished. We saw how good the first one was, and it's frustrating that it got prematurely cancelled. But also part of the fun of thinking about directors' unmade films is wondering how they would have approached the material, and we have a pretty good idea of how he would have done this. So yeah, I think it's a less fun one to think about, but it's definitely the one I'm most frustrated that didn't happen. And so for that reason, I'd give this one a B. So after Fight Club, David Fincher was set to re-team with Brad Pitt for an adaptation of Anthony Bourdain's memoirs, Kitchen Confidential. The book was renowned at the time for giving a real honest depiction of what working in a kitchen is actually like, the chaos of it, the casual drug use, and showing just how pressurized an environment it is. So Pitt wasn't going to play Bourdain himself, this wasn't going to be a biopic, but he's instead going to play a fictionalized version of him called Luke Kasdan. He'd be the executive chef at a fancy restaurant in Manhattan, and it would follow a few days in his rockstar bohemian chef life as he tries to balance the trials of the job and his personal life as well. I really love stories about chefs and kitchens. I really love The Bear, I love Boiling Point, and I'm a big fan of Anthony Bourdain himself. So this kind of movie sounds really fascinating to me. I would love to see as well how David Fincher would shoot food. Again, with chefs, everything has to be so exact. David Fincher's style is so precise and exact. Fortunately, the movie never did get made, but if you're really keen to see something, it did get turned into a short-lived TV show with Bradley Cooper, so if you want to see something, that's out there. But yeah, I'm really sad this David Fincher Brad Pitt version never materialized. Apparently there is a good script out there, but unfortunately it's never been leaked online. But if I had to rank this, I think I'd give this an S. So Chemical Pink is a book by Katie Andoli, and it's about this female bodybuilder who moves to California to pursue her dreams of bodybuilding. She then meets this eccentric rich guy who promises to fund and train her, and she essentially hands over complete control of her life to this guy. She's stuck in this situation where she's like let go of her autonomy, but is the price of that worth achieving her goals? Variety reported that Andoli would be adapting her own script, but there's other reports that Chuck Palahniuk, the writer of Fight Club, would be adapting the book. This one never really got that far into development, and I think that's kind of a shame because it sounds like it would be in a similar vein to Fight Club, and I think David Fincher kind of exploring that world, but from a more feminine angle, would have been really interesting. You know, when you hear stories about bodybuilding, you don't really hear it from that perspective. There was reports that another filmmaker was set to take this to screen after Fincher, but that never materialized. So it's a real shame that this one never made it to screen in any capacity, because it sounds really interesting to me. I think I'd give this a B. Rendezvous with Rama is a book written by Arthur C. Clarke. He's the guy that wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's about this big cylindrical spaceship that enters the solar system that people call Rama, and a group of human explorers intercept and investigate the ship. But notoriously, the book is very hard to adapt to screen. It doesn't have a typical plot structure, there's no central conflict, there's no real character growth. And especially in the early 2000s, it would have been really difficult to show off the scale of what's described in the book. This one spent years in development hell. There was never actually a full script developed, and it just sort of fell by the wayside over the years. This is one that's maybe for the best, and I say this because Denis Villeneuve, the director of Blade Runner 2049, Dune, Arrival, is set to do his own adaptation of Rendezvous with Rama, and that man is essentially the king of science fiction cinema at this point. It's hard to imagine anyone else doing it as good as he would. So yeah, as much as I love Fincher and I love his films, I think the version he would have made in the early 2000s, it would have been risky. I think I'd give this one an E. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a science fiction novel that's been adapted a couple of times already into film. The first time in 1954 and then again in 1997. It's set in the late 1800s when there's rumours of a sea monster attacking ships, so the government sends out a ship to investigate. But they soon discover that the sea monster is actually a man-made submarine being run by the enigmatic Captain Nemo. This would have been Fincher's follow-up to The Social Network, and he said, quote, "I really want to try do my Empire Strikes Back, and I think 20,000 Leagues is the title." Scott Z. Burns was approached to write the script. He's the guy that did The Bourne Ultimatum and Contagion. Fincher also approached his longtime collaborator Brad Pitt to star, but he turned it down. So without his first choice, Fincher switched to Channing Tatum instead. At that point, he was known for Step Up and G.I. Joe. But Disney did not want Channing Tatum. They wanted Chris Hemsworth instead, and so this was the start of the creative differences. Then there was the fact that Disney had produced two massive flops with John Carter and The Lone Ranger, and so the prospect of doing something like 20,000 Leagues, which would have been very expensive, seemed a lot more risky. Ultimately, Disney and Fincher weren't able to align on the project, and so he left in 2013. I have no attachment to 20,000 Leagues as a property, but Fincher trying to do his own Empire Strikes Back is really interesting to me. It's interesting that he would have said that about this project. And we also just don't get a huge amount of water movies. I know that's a weird thing to be excited about, but I think it's one of those things that it's so difficult to do and so hard to do well that you never really see much of it. But I do wonder how the CGI would have aged. I do think that is a problem that we're now seeing with some of his older films. So yeah, I'm glad this didn't happen, especially because he went on to do Gone Girl instead, which I think is a fantastic film. So yeah, I think I'd give this one a D. The Reincarnation of Peter Proud is a book by Max Elric, and it's about a college professor who's having these weird nightmares that he thinks are flashbacks to a previous life. And so he goes on to try and solve the murder of who he thinks he was in a previous incarnation. This was already adapted into a film in 1975, but it didn't get the best reviews, so it's not one people seem to remember. Fincher was set to re-team with Seven writer Andrew Kevin Walker, with shooting scheduled for 2016, but unfortunately the project just never left development. This is something I really would have loved to see Fincher do, a kind of supernatural, paranoid thriller. If this did go ahead, I really wonder if they would have kept the title. It's a very similar kind of title to The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, but the cinema landscape in 2016 and today is very different than 2008. And the title, The Reincarnation of Peter Proud, is very low-key. I don't think it's one people would be rushing out to on title alone. But yeah, real shame this one didn't happen. I'd give this one an A. So Squids was a project written by David Ayer. He's a writer-director best known for Training Day, for Fury, and for the 2016 version of Suicide Squad. And this story was allegedly a coming-of-age story set in a submarine during the Cold War. There's very little information about this one. It's possible that there wasn't even a fully completed script. And maybe if there was a super compelling script, I'd be interested, but based on idea alone, this one doesn't excite me very much. I think I'd give this an F. Torso was a graphic novel written by Mark Andrecchio and Brian Michael Bendis. He's actually the guy that co-created Jessica Jones and Miles Morales. And Torso was based on the true story of the Cleveland Torso murderer. This was an unidentified serial killer in the 1930s who would behead and dismember his victims and occasionally sever their torso. The murders were especially messed up because police weren't even able to identify the bodies because he'd cut their heads off, and this was obviously pre-forensic science. The movie would have focused on Elliot Ness, the guy famous for taking down Al Capone and famously played by Kevin Costner in The Untouchables, and it was apparently Ness himself that Fincher was interested in rather than the killing. He wanted to do a deconstruction of Elliot Ness and show the man behind the icon. Apparently the film was set to feature Matt Damon, Casey Affleck, Gary Oldman and Rachel McAdams, but Paramount let their rights to the project lapse, and so Fincher went on to do The Social Network instead. And okay, look, would I rather have Torso than The Social Network? Definitely not. The Social Network is one of my favourite films of all time. But it would have been nice to get this one. Again, it's interesting that he was sort of circling back to serial killers again so soon after directing Zodiac. And it would have been really interesting to see how Fincher would approach a topic he's already explored before from a slightly different angle. And apparently the graphic novel is really good, so there's a strong foundation there. So yeah, I think I'd give this one an A. So here's my final ranking for the unmade David Fincher films. Let me know which ones you would have been most interested in seeing on screen in the comments below. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss anything else coming up on the channel, make sure to subscribe.